The ballroom at the Fairmont Grand Hotel was a vision of opulence, a scene lifted straight from the pages of a high society magazine. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the elegantly dressed attendees, their reflections dancing in the polished marble floors. The gentle clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation wove together, forming a soundscape of sophistication. It was the annual Charity Gala, an event that every year drew some of the nation's most powerful and influential figures. Business moguls, A-list actors, esteemed journalists, and political elites, all gathered under one roof, united by a common cause, raising funds to support underprivileged youth. Beyond the dazzling gowns and tailored tuxedos, beyond the grandeur of the venue, there was an energy in the air, an unspoken anticipation. It wasn't just about the cause. It never was. Galas like these were stages where alliances were formed, deals were struck, and, perhaps most importantly, reputations were both polished and shattered. Among the crowd, seated in a less conspicuous corner, was Barron Trump. At just 18 years old, he had inherited the effortless presence of someone accustomed to public scrutiny, though he neither sought nor encouraged attention. Tall, with a naturally imposing frame, he carried himself with a quiet composure that seemed almost at odds with his age. He had not arrived with a grand entrance, nor had he inserted himself into the swirling circles of conversation that dotted the ballroom. Instead, he observed. His piercing blue eyes, intelligent and unwavering, moved over the room, catching details others might have missed. The way a businessman's smile tightened ever so slightly when he turned from one conversation to another. The way an actress laughed, just a touch too loud, as if trying to convince those around her that she belonged. The way the journalist, tonight's keynote speaker, seemed almost electric with confidence, their presence commanding attention even before they reached the stage. Barron had been invited by a family friend, a quiet gesture meant to introduce him to a different world. Unlike many of the attendees who lived for the spotlight and the performance of the evening, he seemed content in the background. He was not here for political optics, nor to make a statement. And yet, before the night was over, that was exactly what would happen. The gala unfolded as expected. A string quartet played softly in the background, their melody blending seamlessly with the gentle hum of conversation. Waitstaff moved with practiced elegance, offering trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres and vintage champagne. There was an ease to it all, a rhythm of luxury that everyone followed instinctively. Yet beneath the surface, something simmered. The true event, the moment everyone was waiting for, had yet to begin. The journalist. Predictable, polished, harmless. But then their tone shifted. Subtly at first. A casual remark about the political climate. A joke about a well-known senator's latest gaffe. The audience chuckled, some more hesitantly than others. The remarks became sharper. They moved from policy to personality, poking fun at public figures. Some guests laughed freely, emboldened by the journalist's confidence. Others exchanged wary glances, their smiles tightening. Then the focus shifted, a name that never failed to ignite a reaction. Donald Trump. Well, we can't talk about the state of the world without mentioning the man who made orange the new black, the journalist quipped, earning scattered laughter. Love him or hate him, you have to admit, he's the gift that keeps on giving for people like me. The room's response was mixed. Some laughed openly, others merely offered polite chuckles. A few guests shifted in their seats. At his table, Barron remained motionless. If the journalist noticed his presence, they gave no indication. At least, not yet. The jokes kept coming, each one sharper than the last. Trump's policies, his tweets, his public appearances. The crowd's reaction continued to fragment. Some fully engaged, others visibly uncomfortable. But the journalist wasn't finished. And, of course, they said, pausing for effect, we can't forget his most overlooked legacy, the next generation. A ripple of unease moved through the room. The next words landed like a slow-motion car crash. Inevitable, yet impossible to look away from. Let's talk about Barron. The air shifted. A collective inhale. Heads turned, some toward the stage, others toward Barron, whose name had just been thrust under the brightest spotlight in the room. The journalist's tone remained playful, but the words carried weight. Imagine growing up in a golden tower, surrounded by marble everything, while your dad is tweeting about confrontation, and the rest of us are just trying to survive Monday mornings. That must have been character building. The attempt at humor fell flat. Some in the crowd chuckled nervously, but most sat in stunned silence. Unasked for and unwelcome, the spotlight had landed squarely on Barron Trump. In that moment, all eyes were on him, waiting, expecting. Would he laugh it off? Shrink under the weight of the moment, ignore it altogether? But instead of crumbling, instead of reacting in anger or discomfort, Barron remained exactly as he had been all evening, calm, composed, unmoved. He didn't shift in his chair, didn't glance around nervously, didn't break eye contact with the stage. The silence stretched. It grew louder. Even the journalist, standing confidently just moments ago, seemed to falter slightly, their smirk flickering as they glanced toward Barron's table. Perhaps they had expected a laugh. Perhaps they had expected anything but this. But Barron Trump had already made his statement, without saying a word. And as the night continued, as the weight of the moment settled over the ballroom, it became clear. This was far from over. What he did next, however, would leave the entire room reeling. The energy in the ballroom shifted. It was subtle at first, like the faintest change in pressure before a storm rolls in. The air grew heavier. The quiet clinking of glasses slowed, and the polite, scattered laughter that had filled the room moments earlier began to wither. Conversations that had previously hummed in the background faded to silence as all attention turned toward the stage. The journalist, still standing confidently under the spotlight, had barely paused between their last joke and the next, their voice carrying effortlessly through the room. And then their focus landed squarely on Donald Trump. Well, we can't talk about the state of the world without mentioning the man who made orange the new black, the journalist quipped, drawing a mix of chuckles and hesitant laughter from the audience. Love him or hate him, you have to admit he's the gift that keeps on giving, for people like me. The reaction was instant, yet fractured. Some guests, those who thrived on political humor, laughed openly, embracing the jab with amusement. Others shifted in their seats, their smiles tightening. There were a few glances exchanged across tables, a quiet recognition of the moment's weight. For all the sharp commentary the journalist had delivered over the years, this room, this audience, carried a different dynamic. The stakes felt different. And in the back of the room, seated with an air of quiet detachment, was Barron Trump. He remained motionless, his presence almost an enigma in the sea of reactions around him. His posture was relaxed but poised, his expression an unreadable mask. If the journalist had noticed him before, they hadn't let on. At least not yet. The jokes continued, the words carefully curated but increasingly pointed. The journalist shifted from broad political humor to specifics. They spoke of Trump's policies, poking fun at controversial decisions. They mimicked his mannerisms, exaggerating his speech patterns with well-practiced ease. They referenced infamous tweets, bringing up the viral Covef incident that had once dominated headlines. With each line, the laughter became more fragmented. It was no longer the effortless amusement that had accompanied the earlier jokes. Instead, the reaction felt divided. Some guests willing to laugh along, others growing increasingly stiff in their seats. A few glanced around, gauging the expressions of their table mates. Barron, however, didn't so much as blink. The journalist, perhaps emboldened by the initial response, pressed further. And, of course, they said, pausing just long enough to let the tension rise, we can't forget his most overlooked legacy. The next generation. A ripple of unease moved through the room. At that moment, everyone understood what was coming next. Barron's name hung in the air before it was even spoken. Let's talk about Barron. The reaction was immediate. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted into something more tangible. A collective inhale swept across the ballroom. Conversations halted entirely. Eyes darted toward Barron's table, where the young man now found himself at the very center of attention. For the first time that evening, the journalist's confident rhythm wavered. But they pushed on. Imagine growing up in a golden tower, surrounded by marble everything, while your dad is tweeting about coffee and the rest of us are just trying to survive Monday mornings. A thin, uncomfortable chuckle bubbled from a few corners of the room, but it quickly fizzled out. The joke had landed, but not in the way the journalist had intended. It wasn't the punchline that lingered. It was the silence that followed. And in that silence sat Barron Trump, unshaken. The weight of the room had shifted onto him, an uninvited spotlight cast directly over his figure. But rather than shrinking under its glare, he remained precisely as he had been moments before, calm, composed, his hands resting lightly on the table. If he felt any flicker of discomfort, he gave no indication. If he felt anger, it did not show. There was no nervous shift in posture, no glance around the room to gauge reactions, no visible change in expression. The ballroom, moments earlier filled with the journalist's confident humor, now felt like a stage frozen in time, its audience caught in limbo between curiosity and discomfort. The journalist, perhaps sensing the change in atmosphere, let out a small chuckle, attempting to ease the growing tension. "Well, tough crowd," they said lightly, adjusting the microphone. A murmur of forced laughter rippled through a few tables, but it was clear the moment had not landed as expected. For the first time that evening, the journalist looked slightly less at ease. They glanced toward Barron's table, as if seeking some kind of reaction, an acknowledgement, a smirk, a flash of emotion that would break the uneasy silence. But Barron Trump gave them nothing, absolutely nothing. He simply sat there, unmoving, unbothered. And in that stillness, he made a statement louder than words ever could. Some in the crowd seemed to realize it before the journalist did. A few guests cast quick glances at each other, recognizing what was happening. This wasn't the reaction the journalist had anticipated. It wasn't even a reaction at all. It was something more powerful. It was control, and that control had shifted entirely in Barron's favor. The journalist, now visibly aware of the miscalculation, hesitated for the briefest second before attempting to steer the evening back on track. "Well," they said, forcing another chuckle, "I see we have a very stoic crowd tonight." The attempt at humor did little to mend the energy in the room. The moment had passed, but the weight of it still lingered. For the first time since stepping onto the stage, the journalist seemed to realize that the room was no longer theirs to command. Barron, without a single word, had shifted the entire dynamic. And as the journalists moved on, attempting to recover their rhythm, the ballroom itself seemed to settle into a strange new tension, one that had not existed before. Because now, the narrative had changed. Now, all eyes were no longer on the journalist. They were on Barron Trump. And everyone was waiting to see what he would do next. Because whatever it was going to be unforgettable. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, not the awkward lull of a conversation dying out, nor the polite pause between speeches. This was different. This was the kind of silence that stretched long and heavy, wrapping itself around the room like a force that demanded to be felt. A moment ago, the journalist had been in command of the night, their sharp wit slicing through the air with ease. The room had belonged to them. The laughter, the applause, the anticipation, it had all been on their terms. And yet, in a matter of seconds, all of it had unraveled. Not because of an outburst, not because of an argument, but because of something far more unsettling. Barron Trump's complete and utter stillness. The journalist had likely expected something different. A quiet chuckle, a dismissive shake of the head, perhaps even a roll of the eyes. Anything that would allow them to push forward, to reclaim the moment before it slipped too far out of their grasp. But they got none of that. Instead, Barron had met the moment with something far more powerful. An unshaken, unwavering, almost unnervingly composed silence. It wasn't indifference. No, that would have been easier to dismiss. This was something else entirely. It was measured, intentional, a quiet defiance that held more weight than any sharp reply ever could. The room felt it. The guests who had chuckled moments ago now sat motionless, as if only just realizing the full impact of what had transpired. Some lowered their gazes, suddenly aware of the discomfort hanging in the air. Others stole glances at Barron, as though searching for some flicker of emotion, anger, embarrassment, even amusement. But there was none. His expression remained unreadable, his posture perfectly composed. It was as if his silence itself was speaking. It said, "I hear you, I see you, and I am not moved." A murmur rippled through the room, the sound barely more than a whisper, but enough to disturb the thick tension that had settled over the ballroom. A few guests shifted in their seats, their movements cautious, uncertain. Even the journalist, standing under the glow of the stage lights, was no longer as assured as they had been mere moments ago. They cleared their throat, adjusting their stance ever so slightly. "Tough crowd," they muttered into the microphone, forcing a chuckle. This time, no one laughed. The air was too thick with unspoken realization. And then, Barron moved. It was subtle at first. A small shift, a quiet exhale. Then, with deliberate ease, he pushed back his chair. The soft scrape of the chair legs against the polished floor was the only sound in the room. And somehow, that sound alone sent a shiver of anticipation through the air. Every set of eyes locked onto him as he rose to his full height. At just over 6 feet tall, Barron Trump was an imposing presence, not simply because of his stature, but because of the way he carried himself. There was no hesitation in his movement, no uncertainty in his posture. He did not glance around nervously, nor did he hurry to break the silence. He simply stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the room settle around him. Then he turned. His gaze swept across the room, not searching, not questioning, but observing. He took in the expressions of the guests, the journalists, the business moguls, the actors. He looked at the faces that had moments ago been amused, entertained, unaware. And then, finally, his eyes settled on the journalist. The shift in atmosphere was almost tangible. Where there had once been amusement, there was now uncertainty. Where there had once been confidence, there was now hesitation. The journalist, who had commanded the stage so effortlessly before, now seemed smaller, less sure of themselves. They straightened slightly, perhaps out of instinct, but it was clear the power in the room had shifted. Barron didn't need to speak, not yet. His silence had already spoken volumes, and still the room waited. For a word, a reaction. But Barron was in no hurry. With the same calm composure he had held all evening, he took a step forward, then another, and another. Each step measured, controlled, purposeful. The crowd watched, their eyes wide with something between anticipation and disbelief. No one had expected this. No one had predicted that the quietest person in the room would suddenly become the most powerful presence among them. And yet, here he was, owning the moment without even needing to try. As he neared the stage, the journalist's expression flickered, just for a second. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A split-second flash of uncertainty. Barron stepped onto the stage, and suddenly the balance of power shifted entirely. For the first time that evening, the journalist was no longer in control of the moment. Barron was, and the entire room knew it. He stopped just a few feet away, standing with the same unshaken composure that had left the entire ballroom speechless. The journalist, now face to face with him, seemed to realize the magnitude of the situation. Their earlier bravado had dimmed. The confidence in their stance had faltered, because in that moment, standing under the bright lights of the ballroom, Barron Trump had done what no one had expected. He had taken control, not through anger, not through words, but through sheer, undeniable presence. The room held its breath. What would he say? Would he retaliate? Fire back with a sharp-witted remark? Dismiss the moment entirely? The weight of the anticipation was nearly suffocating. And then, a small, almost imperceptible shift. Barron tilted his head slightly, regarding the journalist with the same calm gaze he had held all night. Then, with an ease so effortless it felt deliberate, he let out the quietest, most knowing smile. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't forced. It was something far more powerful. It was understanding, a silent message that spoke louder than any speech ever could. And in that moment, it became clear Barron Trump didn't need to respond, because he had already won. The journalist knew it. The audience knew it. And Barron, he had known it all along. Without another word, he turned, stepping away from the stage with the same steady confidence he had carried throughout the entire evening. The crowd, still stunned, parted for him as he walked back to his seat. And just like that, the moment ended. But no one in that room would ever forget it. Because, in a single, effortless move, Barron Trump had stolen the show. And all he had needed was silence.